No matter how good you are, if you stay for too long, you spoil it. A dancer always knows when to leave the stage. Professor PLO Lumumba there, starting us off with quite an image today.
Yeah, it really grabs you, doesn't it? Sets the tone immediately.
It does. And for you listening, especially if you're keen to understand what's shaping Kenya right now, this whole idea of, well, timely exits and the need for fresh leadership, it's probably something you thought about.
Absolutely. And what's interesting is how it frames the core issue, that tension between keeping experience and needing new energy, new perspectives.
Oh.
When does staying on stop being service?
Exactly. And that's really the core of our deep dive today. You shared this recent YouTube discussion featuring Professor Lumumba, focusing specifically on leadership in Kenya.
That's right.
So our mission here is to pull out the key insights from his analysis, his take on the current leadership, and crucially, the arguments he makes for why a real shift is needed. We want to give you a clear picture of his view on why change feels so urgent.
It's about getting to grips with the fundamental problems that, well, at least in Professor Lumumba's view, are holding Kenya back. Why he thinks a different path is needed, and needed now.
So he kicks off right there with this idea of knowing when to leave the stage. He even mentions the Tanzanian president.
Right, as an example of someone who perhaps understands this timing.
What's the main point he's making with that comparison?
Well, I think he's highlighting the wisdom in stepping aside while you're still effective, ensuring a smooth transition, making space for others. It's about thinking long-term for the country, not just the individual leader's time in office.
And then he brings up this phrase, the Messiah syndrome. What exactly does he mean by that?
It's this belief some leaders developed that they are indispensable, that only they can lead, only they have the answers.
And why is that so dangerous, according to him?
Because it just shuts down everything else, doesn't it? New ideas get stifled, potential successors aren't nurtured, and the leader themselves might stop adapting because they believe they're, well, infallible. It's a trap.
He contrasts that with Nelson Mandela, who deliberately stepped back into more of an advisory role.
Yeah, a completely different model. Mandela showed leadership is about empowerment, about building something sustainable that outlasts you. The cause is bigger than the person. That's the key difference Lumumba seems to be highlighting.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Devolution. This is interesting because Lumumba was actually involved in the Constitution review process.
He was.
But his current view on the 37 counties is, well, pretty critical. He preferred the original idea of 14 units.
That's right. His argument now is that the 47 counties, as they exist, often aren't really economically viable on their own, and maybe more concerning for him, they've become hotbeds for ethnic politics, even down to the clan level in some cases.
So he feels they've deepened divisions rather than strengthening the nation.
That seems to be his assessment. He thinks the chance to create larger, economically stronger regional blocs was missed, largely due to political resistance to merging counties.
And that resistance, the desire to keep the 47 units, has had lasting negative effects in his view.
Exactly. He sees it as a kind of foundational issue. The political dynamics at the time, wanting to maintain those local power bases perhaps, overrode what might have been a more economically rational and maybe less ethnically charged system.
This connects to a broader theme in his critique, doesn't it? This sense that the Constitution itself isn't being fully implemented or respected. He sounds quite pained by it.
Deeply pained. You can hear it. He was there, involved in crafting it, and now he sees the political class, as he puts it, undermining it for, short-term political gain.
What are some specific examples he gives of this failure?
Oh, he lists quite a few. Strangling devolution, basically starving it or interfering from the center. Blatantly ignoring Chapter 6 on leadership and integrity, the ethical standards that are supposed to apply.
Right, the gap between the requirements on paper and who actually gets elected or appointed.
Precisely. Then there's financial mismanagement, these huge pending bills that cripple services. Nepotism, political patronage in appointments instead of merit.
It paints a picture of a system really struggling to live up to its own rules.
And he doesn't stop there. He points to blunders in foreign policy, mentioning issues with the DRC, Sudan, South Sudan, the Sahrawi Republic, causing tensions even within the East African community.
Wow.
Failure to address gender parity requirements in the Constitution, ongoing problems with the electoral system, the IEBC controversies. It's a long list.
And things like the BBI process, NADCO, the attempts to entrench CDF. He sees these as efforts against the constitutional order.
Yes, fundamentally. He views them as attempts by the political class to reshape the rules for their own convenience or benefit, rather than respecting the spirit of the 2010 Constitution.
He also brings up the pay for MPs, saying it's disproportionately high compared to Kenya's GDP.
His argument there is that such high rewards attract people motivated by personal enrichment, not public service. It fundamentally skews the kind of people who enter politics and what they prioritize once they're there. That ties back to that idea of leaders not caring about the country itself.
He then makes this interesting comparison, looking back at the first generation of Kenyan leaders pre-1966. He mentions Saroni, Mboya, even early Kenyatta and Odinga. He acknowledges they had flaws, but
He suggests they had a broader vision, a sense of looking beyond their immediate time. He feels something shifted around 1964 with the Kanu-Kadu merger.
what was the shift?
Towards more short-term thinking, marriages of convenience in politics, less focus on long-term national building, more on immediate political positioning.
He also mentions other past leaders he admired, like J.M. Kariuki and Martin Shikuku.
Yes, people he saw as genuinely committed to the country's well-being, willing to speak truth to power.
And the contrast with today's leaders, in his view, is stark.
Extremely stark. He's quite blunt, saying that the current crop of politicians, right across the board, are simply not interested in the country. Their main focus, he argues, is constantly shifting political formations for personal gain.
He cites that statistic about how many parties leading figures have been in over 25 years.
Yeah, something like 6 or more formations for many. It really paints a picture of politics devoid of principle, driven by expediency.
And the political parties themselves.
He sees them largely as vehicles for personal cults and tribal kingpins. Low-voltage warlords, I think is a term he uses. Not anchored in any real ideology or national vision, just platforms for ambition.
Which logically leads to the whole issue of mistrust around elections and the IEBC.
Exactly. It's not just about technical failures, he argues.
Yeah.
The root cause is this profound lack of trust within the political class itself. Everyone suspects everyone else of trying to rig the game.
So the fight is always about who controls the electoral body.
Yes. Who gets to appoint the commissioners they think they can, well, manipulate? He finds the fact that ballot papers have to be printed outside Kenya a real indictment, a sign that Kenyans don't trust other Kenyans with the basics of democracy.
He's very forceful on this point, isn't he? Saying this whole generation of politicians needs to basically retire.
He is. He says they've been around since his university days, and they just perpetuate the same ethnic divisions and cycles of mistrust. They need to be consigned to the Museum of History, as he puts it, for the country to move forward.
He uses that analogy about the Israelites leaving Egypt.
Right, but Egypt remaining in them. Meaning you can change the faces, but if the old mindset, the old ways of division and self-interest persist, then nothing truly changes. He applies that directly to the current political establishment.
But it's not all doom and gloom. He does talk about the Gen Z protests against the finance bill.
Yes, he sees that as a potentially pivotal moment, a moment where fear was conquered. He believes something shifted permanently then.
How so?
Their continued engagement, especially online, the way they organized, he thinks it's put genuine fear into both the government and the opposition. It's a new factor in the equation.
But he also cautions them, right?
He does. He stresses the need for these young people and others of goodwill to get organized politically, to translate that energy into real voting power and coherent political formations focused on national issues, not just personalities. He warns against presidential hopefuls declaring too early.
So potential for change, but it needs direction and organization.
Precisely. He calls it guarded optimism. He sees the opening, but knows the hard work of organizing and building credible alternatives still needs to happen.
Okay, let's talk about corruption. It's a recurring theme, obviously. What's Lumumba's take on tackling it?
He sees it as endemic, deeply rooted. He points out the limitations of the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission, the EACC. It can investigate, it can recommend prosecution, but
the cases often stall or get withdrawn.
Exactly. That's a major bottleneck. But he also emphasizes it's not just about institutions. Society itself has to become intolerant of corruption. We need to actively shame and ostracize the corrupt.
He compares the slow pace of Kenyan cases to how quickly things move elsewhere sometimes.
And he connects it to a broader cultural issue, perhaps a general lack of adherence to systems and procedures. He mentions driving habits, appointment processes. It's all linked, this willingness to cut corners or disregard rules.
There was also that caller, Dungo, who mentioned the need for personal responsibility.
Yes, that was a great point. That fighting corruption starts with each individual looking at their own actions, refusing to participate even in small ways.
Lumumba also talks about his own time heading the anti-corruption body, the KACC.
Right, and the incredible pushback he faced, trying to get MPs to simply declare their income, for instance. It shows the powerful vested interests fighting against transparency.
And this problem isn't just at the national level. He talks about corruption in the counties, too.
Oh, yes. The devolution of corruption, as some call it. He gives examples of governors or county officials accumulating wealth incredibly quickly after taking office. Devolution was meant to bring resources closer, but it also created new avenues for misuse, sadly.
Okay, another specific issue. The NGCDF, the Constituency Development Fund. What's his position there?
He's careful to say the idea of funds for local development isn't necessarily bad. The problem, for him, is the direct control and oversight by members of parliament, MCAs, women reps, senators.
Why is that the problem?
Conflict of interest, basically. He sees it becoming a sort of slush fund used for influence peddling and political patronage rather than objective development priorities. He thinks the fund should go through the devolved units, with politicians playing an oversight role, not a managerial one.
And he was particularly critical of the attempt to anchor NGCDF in the Constitution after the courts ruled against it.
Very critical. He sees that as a blatant attempt to circumvent a court ruling, to ignore constitutionalism just to protect a system that benefits the politicians directly. A really worrying sign about respect for the rule of law.
Even though NADCO recommendations might see it implemented anyway.
He acknowledges that reality, but seems to take a long view, suggesting such moves against the constitutional grain might eventually be undone. But the immediate act itself is what concerns him deeply.
Finally, his comments on the judiciary were,
well,
quite shocking.
They were incredibly strong. Pathetic, I believe was the word he used. The worst state he's seen it in. He cites both empirical and anecdotal evidence suggesting justice is sometimes on sale. Talk of facilitation fees.
That's a devastating assessment of a core institution.
Absolutely. He points to the unprecedented situation of the Chief Justice herself litigating in her own courts. He mentions specific rulings, like the one concerning the Deputy Chief Justice and paneling judges. The lack of a resignation culture when things go wrong.
And his conclusion from all this?
It led him to make what he called a painful suggestion, that the Supreme Court needs to be reconstituted. That's how serious he believes the crisis of confidence and integrity in the judiciary has become.
So wrapping this all up, the picture Professor Lumumba paints is, well, it's deeply concerning, isn't it? Leadership marked by self-interest, by short-term political games, a disregard for the Constitution, and ultimately a lack of genuine care for the country's future.
Yeah, that's the core message. And coupled with that, an urgent, almost desperate call for fundamental change, driven by citizens, especially the youth, waking up and demanding better.
It's a powerful analysis highlighting why change feels not just desirable, but absolutely critical for Kenya.
A real call to action, framed as a necessity.
So, thinking about everything Professor Lumumba laid out, here's something for you to reflect on. Given his diagnosis of the problems in leadership and the urgent need for a new direction, what's one specific action, maybe small, maybe bigger, that you feel you could take to contribute, even in a small way, to that positive change he believes Kenya needs and can achieve? What's your role in shaping what comes next?
It really brings it back to the individual, doesn't it? A crucial question.
Definitely food for thought. And remember, this deep dive has just scratched the surface. If you found Professor Lumumba's perspective compelling, we really encourage you to find the full YouTube discussion for a much deeper understanding.